So Ankush, let's go back a little bit. I mean, obviously, I am. I've spent a lot of time actually with these type of like email scams and certainly the phone scams. In fact, I've been trying whenever I get one from like the IRS supposedly or about my computer, I try and get them on tape and mess around with them. Um, give us a sense of just like it is amazing to me the response that we get from scammers in a situation like this. Like they're on it immediately.
They are on it immediately, and I mean it's really startling. I mean, actually, there's some very interesting data that the FTC has put out this week after my piece came out that actually I think sort of addresses your question head on. Um, you know, Basically, they have started releasing numbers on a daily basis concerning the number of fraud complaints related to coronavirus issues, right? And we can talk about what types of scams those are, but just to give you a sense of the numbers, a little over a week ago, so that's about a quarter into the year, they had under 4,000 complaints related to coronavirus, right? On Tuesday of this week, they reported that in the week between, the number had doubled to 7,800 complaints, totaling about $4.8 million in losses reported. On Wednesday, so yesterday, those numbers went up again to 8,400 complaints, $5.9 million. So that's an 8% increase in complaints, 20% in reported losses, over $1 million in a day. And today the numbers went up again to 9,200 complaints, $6.2 million in losses, with sort of a median loss of $600. So they really have descended, and I would have loved to have been wrong about an issue like this, but these numbers are startling even to me. The rate of increase, and I fear that it's not going to slow down, and I think it's going to get worse, owing in large part to the kind of information uncertainty that we're all operating under as a result of kind of the government's handling of this crisis.
Well, there seems to me that both this is an outgrowth of the way that the federal government has handled this crisis, and in many respects, a metaphor, in addition to its own problem, because we had pre-existing, the way you deal with this, it seems to me, is by having dealt with other problems in the past, so that when you get to an inflection point, when you get into a crisis mode, you have the mechanisms already, or you've already done enough to lay the groundwork to prepare for this. And what your piece makes absolutely clear is there's been none of that. In fact, it's almost been exactly the opposite. Give us a sense of what the federal government has been doing about scams in general, right? I mean, I presume it's not like somebody wakes up 3 days ago and goes, I'm going to get in the scamming business. I've never done this before, but I could throw something together. That's not what happens, right?
No, I mean, these are surprisingly sophisticated operations, and they disproportionately tend to operate abroad. And, I'll just give you my own experience having dealt with this scam related to an industry called binary options. And exactly what it was is not really that important. It was a giant scam operating largely out of Israel. And it had been around for years, I think billions of dollars in worldwide losses dispersed across the globe. And what we come to find out is that these were highly managed call centers, effectively, hundreds of employees with elaborate phone and computer setups, structured daily operations and targets and managerial arrangements. They're not actually these fly-by-night operations. And I think what you see, rather than things springing up per se, are fraudsters adapting to the environment that is available to them, right? So migrating from maybe financial frauds aren't really going to work so well anymore because people have less disposable income. But these sorts of frauds may work, right, where you're capitalizing on people's fear and uncertainty about the coronavirus. And you're exactly right. I mean, there is a gigantic structural problem here. As I mentioned in the piece, the Department of Justice's prosecution of fraud is at an all-time low, according to data maintained by Syracuse University over about 30 plus years, which is a startling thing to consider. And it is largely because this Justice Department, and it's a trend that started in Obama, so I don't want to entirely overstate things, but it's gotten particularly acute because this Justice Department has decided to shift law enforcement resources away from financial fraud to things like immigration enforcement, right? The crackdown there, or things like the opioid crisis. And some of those initiatives may have some merit to them, opioids in particular, but others not so much. And so right now, the activity in this area from the criminal enforcement standpoint is at an all-time low. And, as I mentioned in the piece, there are generally already reasons why these kinds of cases aren't particularly attractive to prosecutors. They're difficult, they're lengthy, time-intensive, hard to build cases, and they don't, kind of get you in the press like, unfortunately, a lot of prosecutors like. So you're exactly right. I mean, I think largely what we're experiencing now is really the result of years-long neglect. And there's no way we would have entirely stamped this out, right, or entirely prevented crimes like this from emerging. But, what we're seeing in the FBI data that they release concerning internet crime is a steadily upward trend, right? And I don't think there's any other crime in the country where we sit around and we just see a dramatic upward trend line, and we tolerate it, right? Last year, people reported over $3.5 billion in losses to fraud, the most, again, that had ever been tracked by the FBI in this space. And it's going to be a huge, huge problem that we're going to be dealing with, and one that will be very difficult to turn around, I think, until there's another administration. And one thing that I think is actually kind of interesting is that aside from the structural problems, I actually think this administration's handling in the particulars of this crisis seem to have actually created the conditions for some particular forms of these scams to emerge. And what I mean by that is, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I wanted you to be more specific. I mean, it's obviously the conflicting messages, the lack of messages. These are basically, they create the environment for people to step in and say, oh, there's ambiguity here. This is where we can take advantage of people who are in a semi-state of panic, I would imagine, in terms of the victims, and we can give them answers, right? But go ahead, be more specific with how that happened.
That is exactly right. I mean, information uncertainty is a huge driver of those things. But just to get down into the nitty-gritty, I think that we've seen, based on the reports and what the government agencies are putting out, three broad categories of these scams. And the first of which is people peddling fake vaccines and test kits, right? And there's almost a one-to-one relationship there, right? One, we have a huge obvious shortage of test kits owing to the administration's handling of this. But with respect to these vaccines, I mean, I think a lot of older people who are probably watching the president at these press conferences talk about these sort of marginal treatment options and, kind of off-label or treatment options that are outside of what the health officials are recommending are probably getting primed to become victims of scams like that, right? When you have the president himself saying, well, maybe there are other treatments available, got to think outside the box, whatever. And I think, every time I see him say something like that, I sort of cringe. The second category is
so just to be clear, when the president gets up there and says, like, look, there's a lot of stuff that is, you can try out there that could work just because the FDA has been slow to approve. And then I call up someone like my mom and say, hey, I'm selling, orange shoe polish, which has been proven to help. And, of course it doesn't have FDA, but we're making it available to everybody because the president has, encouraged us. You just go ahead and buy it, as opposed to if the president's up there saying, we have a defined treatment regimen, we're still looking at for stuff, and don't don't let anybody tell you that there's some type of easy solution to this. I mean, that's the difference, right? I mean, one is just setting the table.
Exactly. And I would not be surprised if some of these particular people are actually just peddling access to anti-malarial drugs, right? Which are the sorts of drugs that the president has been getting up and touting, even though there's no systematic evidence that they're actually useful in treating the virus. That's exactly right. And just to continue, the second area where some of this fraud seems to be operating is in offering people access to government funds ahead of the relief checks or the relief funds that people are supposed to be getting through the stimulus bill. And there too, I mean, to your point, I think that is a result, at least partially, of information uncertainty because, you know, I had to struggle to figure out whether and how I might get any stimulus funds. And I'm sure most people still don't understand what is going on because there's not been a consistent message or a clear message from this administration or its officials about that. And so there too, it you know, kind of as you think about it, it's probably not that big of a surprise that people would kind of area like that and think, well, maybe I can take advantage of this kind of information deficit. And lastly, I think the third major category we've seen is people posing as charities claiming to help victims of the coronavirus. And, you know, there too, I mean, I think partially that a scam like that could be offset by government efforts by making clear, or well, I guess first having a clear system in place that is managing the fallout from these cases. You know, we may very well need something like a 9/11 responder type fund for health workers who get sick as a result of this. But right now, the president is on TV every day, you know, telling us it's not that bad and, you know, it's concentrated in certain places. And I think a lot of people are probably seeing that and wanting to do something to help out. And I don't think the government is giving us any clear guidance on, you know, what they're doing that might allow us to kind of feel like, you know, the public doesn't need to step in.
Right. So I mean, so for folks out there, if they wanted to warn their parents, let's say, well, you know what, we'll hold off on that for a moment, but I just want to just focus a little bit more on, so there has been a policy decision not to have any type of like, in terms of like dedicating resources to this, that you say has been growing since the Obama administration, became more acute during the Trump administration. I'm frankly shocked that they're not interested in rooting out financial fraud under the Trump administration. That's me being facetious. And and it's also, there is something ingrained in the I guess the DNA, if you will, of a ambitious prosecutor, where this is not the area you want to be if you're ambitious in terms of moving up the ladder, because it's just simply not a sexy type of arena. With those things understood, like, give us a sense of what kind of scams are out there. You mentioned, you know, trying to sell, you know, supposed malaria drugs. What other scams are out there that and who are they directed at? I mean, because I think you wrote in the piece that the yield is pretty low, but they are so sophisticated that if I've got 100 people in a room and they're doing, you know, I don't know, 30 calls, you know, an hour at least, you know, maybe more in some instances, we're going to find that 1 in 1,000 person who's going to bite, right? Is that basically how it works?
Yeah, correct.
All right. Well,
Yeah,
so
I mean,
give us a sense of what those scams are.
Well, I think you mean in general or particularly tied to the coronavirus?
I mean, particularly tied to the coronavirus.
I mean, I think the three that I talked about are the biggest ones. There have also been some reports about using some of these these emails to infect devices with malware. You know, and also some reports of people calling, claiming to be government officials, representatives of the CDC and the like, in order to solicit like personal information, things like your social security number and the like, things that can be used for sort of standard run-of-the-mill identity theft. And those two sort of forms of fraud are, again, those are frauds that happen all the time, right? But instead, like right now, what we're seeing is, okay, they're adopting a particular kind of peg, which happens to be the coronavirus. So the email with malware may look like it's coming from the World Health Organization, and I say
Right.
that, but actually that is one that I have seen. So it's not something that is hypothetical. The phone calls that people get maybe, or the emails that people may get may solicit things like your bank account information or social security number or personally identifiable information. The point that you raised about the low yield, as I mentioned, is exactly right. And the question about who these scams are targeted at is an interesting one. In my experience, and so far as I can tell, they are indiscriminate in who they target, right? Meaning just cast as wide a net as possible. But what is the sad reality is that the victims are disproportionately elderly. And that's, for several reasons, one of which is some of these folks may sadly be maybe in cognitive decline, or they may be lonely. That frankly has a lot to do with it in my observation. That makes them more susceptible to someone calling them and talking to them on the phone and things like that, and kind of developing a rapport with them that makes them think that this person is friendly and on their side. And that sort of social interaction, unfortunately, among the elderly population is lower than we'd like to see. And I really am concerned, given obviously the isolation directives that we're now all under, that problem could get even worse. And
Right.
so one of the things that I would ask your listeners and viewers to think about is if you have elderly people in your lives, maybe they're friends or family or whatever, just be in touch with them regularly throughout this. Particularly if you're not in a situation where you can see them. Maybe they're in another city or state or something, or you're in a situation where you can't go to their homes. That sort of regular interaction, I think, among the limited tools available to us in our current moment until we have an opportunity to maybe get a new administration in place and have more serious changes take place, is among, I think, the sort of limited tools that we have available to us among the public to try to mitigate the consequences of these things.
Ankush Kadari, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.